advise you to go back to that in the full, complete version. But there's one point I want to finish off on, which is very important. And Ibn al-Qayyim mentions this in one of his other books, Al-Fawaid. And he makes one short remark. He's speaking about how we come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's a sentence, a very important sentence. He says, فَالْأَشْيَاء عُرِفَتْ بِهِ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ عُرِفَ بِهَا فِي النَّظَرِ وَالْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. Right? So he says, فَالْأَشْيَاء عُرِفَتْ بِهِ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ عُرِفَ بِهَا فِي النَّظَرِ وَالْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. What does it mean? Let me translate what it means. He says, all things are known through him in reality. All things are known through him in reality. Even if he is known through them by way of observation and deduction. By way of observation and deduction. Now, what does this mean? What he's saying here is that even though we can look at things and look at the creation, and through the creation we can come to know something about Allah, right? So, we look at the creation and we see how everything is there for provision to come out of the ground. You have the sun, and you have the rain, and you have, all the things in between, the vegetation. And from that we can derive that Allah is someone who is kind. Allah is merciful. Allah is wise. When we look at the ways and means in His creation, we investigate them, right? So he says, وَإِنْ كَانَ عُرِفَ بِهَا أو فِي النَّظَرِ وَالْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. Right? So even though we can acquire some knowledge by looking at things and deriving some of the attributes of Allah, we can come to know Allah that way. Even though that is so, in reality, it's the other way around, right? فَالْأَشْيَاء عُرِفَتْ بِهِ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ. Right? It is, and this is how he says that the most knowledgeable of the people of Tawheed, this is how they operate. Right? Instead of them looking at things and deriving knowledge of Allah, what they do is they have knowledge of Allah through His names and His attributes. Then from that they acquire knowledge of things in the creation. Now see the difference? So in other words, to give an illustration, right? So a believer starts with the names of Allah, right? And then when he starts investigating and looking at things in the creation, he's learning things about them through the names of Allah. Meaning it's the names of Allah that are providing him the way of looking at that thing. And this is how he gains knowledge of the affairs of the world. This is how the most perfect, the people of Tawheed, the ones who are most deeply rooted and grounded. Now I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you an illustration of this, just to illustrate the point. So let's start. Let's say, for example, there is a name of Allah, Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, and Ash-Shafi, and Tabib, right? So there is, Allah is Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, the one who gives life, the one who takes life, the one who heals and cures, right? This is Ash-Shafi and Tabib. Tabib is not a name of Allah. This is not a name. It's what is from the attributes, but it's not an actual name, right? Tabib, right? Meaning the one who knows of all of the ways and the means of the health and the sickness of His servants. He is the one who knows all of that because He is the creator of all of that. So He is the Tabib in truth, in reality. So now where do we start? So let's look at two different ways we could start. One over here. So we'll start with the names of Allah, and then we'll try to gain an understanding of things, right? So what did he say? فَالْأَشْيَاء عُرِفَتْ بِهِ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ. So when we look at Allah is Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, and we take these names and we look at the creation, we see the earth is barren, it is dead. The rain comes, and before it was lifeless, now it is living again. And we see this continued cycle repeated over and over again. And when we go to study in depth in the details of how this actually happens, and we look at what's actually going on, there could be organisms, there's bacteria, there's different things. And what happens is that when everything is dead, there's no activity, it's dead. And then when it is brought to life again through the heat of the sun and then the rain and everything else comes together and life emerges. Right now, because we are looking at it from the root of Allah's names, we can study it and understand it from the right point of view in a way which aligns with Tawheed, right? Now let's take this another step further. Let me take this another step further. Let's look at the body, for example. Again, sticking to the names of Al-Muhyi wal-Mumit. When you have a wound, for example, you are cut, or a scratch even, something simple as a scratch, what happens is that now is dead material, right? The material has died. So what will happen is you will get a scab, you'll get like the blood, it will arrange itself, it will scab. If it's a wound, it'll seal the wound, it'll be a scab. That flesh around it is dead. So as the scab provides cover underneath, there's life being given, there's regeneration of the dead tissue. So Allah is now bringing the one who brings the living out of the dead and the one who brings the dead out of the living. That has many meanings. It can mean the dead heart, Allah brings the living heart out of it. It means the living heart, Allah brings the dead heart out of it. It can mean the non-living thing Allah brings. It can be, from a sperm or an ova which is dead, no life. Allah brings out from it life. And these are the ma'ani. When you go back to the tafasir, this is what you find in the tafasir. But in the same way, on the body externally, you can see that actual process. Allah is Al-Muhyi wal-Mumit. Right? So when you have a wound, it can be a large wound, it can be a burning, it can be whatever. So what will happen is there'll be a scab, and underneath that tissue has basically died. And so underneath what's happening, there's a process by which through the blood and other means, the skin is being regenerated. Eventually the scab will die and fall off. And then Allah has brought the living once more from something that was dead. Right? Just like the other way around, when it was living and it got hit or cut or whatever, that's now dead. He's brought the dead out of the living. Right? So, and then, you will see some amazing things that will happen in relation to this. Like a few years back, I had a sledgehammer hit this finger here, right here, and it popped that way. And so all of this nail disappeared, and you think, subhanAllah, how on earth is that going to come back to normal? But over a period of 8-9 months, everything grew back to exactly how it was before. How on earth, like how does that happen? Where is the control and how does that happen? Where is the control mechanism? This is from the ajaib of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That something that was dead now is brought back living again as it was before, right? And so we see these things happening around us in all these different levels, right? In the dead earth being brought back to life, as an example. And likewise, externally, on our bodies, we see that process taking place, life and death, right? Allah is the one who is doing this, right? So my point being is that when we study this, how are we thinking and what questions are we asking? We are asking, what did Allah intend by this? What's the wisdom in this, right? So in other words, when we as Muslims and people of Tawheed, when we study the creation, we know the things by way of Allah. So we ask, what did the Creator intend by this? What is the Creator intend by that? what's the wisdom of the Creator in this? And when we ask those questions, we are then directed to truthful understandings. We will have a true understanding of the actual reality, the physical reality or the biological reality. Why? Because we are being guided by the names of Allah into finding answers for the right questions. And this way, there will be an agreement between our creed and our actual understanding of the physical reality that we understand. Why? Because we've been guided by the right knowledge, which is Allah's names and attributes. Right? Do you understand the point that I'm making here? So now I want to illustrate this, which is the point that I'm coming to, which is, now let's give the same example internally. Right? So I gave you the example of the cut or the wound externally, and you know what happens, don't you? That the tissue basically dies, the skin, the tissue dies, and it regenerates, and life is brought back out once again. The same thing happens internally. Right? So just like you see it happening on the skin, the exact same thing happens internally with the actual organs. Right? With the liver, with the kidneys, with the spleen, with the tissues. So let's take the liver as an example. Like you have a liver. Liver is a large organ here, it sits across here, and so what can happen is a part of the liver can become so toxic that it basically dies effectively. So now what the body has to do, it has to do the same process as it does externally, right? It's going to expel the dead tissue through a means or through a mechanism, and then it's going to regenerate that tissue, and it's going to expel the other means. So what will happen is, and this is what they call hepatitis, A, B, C. It's the liver basically, part of it dying. So it gets broken down. That distributes through the blood. Eventually it's eliminated. That process might take weeks or months. But in the process in the background, new liver, because liver can regenerate, right? New tissue is going to be regenerated, and it goes back to what it used to be, right? As that process is taking place, you will suffer some symptoms. You will undergo some symptoms, right? And these symptoms are indicative of the healing process which is happening underneath, right? Now, if you approach this from the angle of the names and the attributes of Allah, and you are thinking to yourself, Allah is Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, Al-Shafi, Tabib, if you're thinking all that, then you will have a particular understanding of what's actually happening here. Right? What's happening here is the servant, through some means or another, he's made violation in his diet, in his habits, right? And something has gone wrong. It's moved away from normality. So now Allah has inbuilt the healing mechanism, right? And that is what is taking place now. What are the names of Allah which are operative here? Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, Al-Shafi, Tabib, right? And then out of that, Allah will heal and cure that person as long as that person takes the right steps, right? That he's careful in his diet, he rests, and so on and so forth. So here now, we will develop a particular understanding of what's actually happening internally, right? Because we've come to have knowledge of things by way of Allah's attributes. Now, if we don't do that, now let's ignore all this over here. Let's ignore all that. Let's come over here. And we don't, use these names and attributes to understand anything what's going on. Then what's going to happen is that we are going to be influenced and affected by other ideas of other people from the people of disbelief and other than them. And we are going to have our knowledge and our sciences that would otherwise be on the right foundation, they are now going to be somewhat polluted, right? They're going to be affected, right? So they will, say, well, the reason why this is happening is because the body is sorry, before I go there, let me come back over here. So let's come back over here. Allah has created the body in a way in which certain meanings can emanate from that. What do I mean? Because sometimes the kuffar, they often say, oh, well, we know there can't be a creator because look at the body, haphazard, it's full of defects. the person becomes ill, right? And there's so many flaws. How can there be a creator? But this is from their jahl, from their misunderstanding, because Allah has created the body in the most perfect way for the purpose for which He created that body, right? So that that man and that woman and the man can experience pleasure and joy and pain, right? And that they realize that the faculties they have, that they are limited and not perfect, whether it's the vision, whether it's, and then among the creatures you see different strengths and different, so Allah has given certain birds vision where they can see so far away, but our vision is limited, right? So there isn't any imperfection in Allah's creation as such. Rather, Allah has created everything in the most perfect way for the purpose for which it serves and for the meanings to emanate out of that. What do I mean? Allah has created man so that the meanings of health and sickness and pleasure and joy and grief and all of these things can emanate from that individual, right? So this is the way that we see all of these things. Whereas the disbeliever, like the way his thinking is, oh, well, look at that. How is man having illness? This is a flaw he's inherited by way of evolution. Right? So because he's a haphazard creation over millions of years of genetic or whatever evolution, right? And as you're having these mutations and selection, right, the diseases are a byproduct of that process, right? So that's why man is like what he is. He suffers these illnesses, and we want to perfect man. We want to fill the gaps in these flaws and so on and so forth. So when they start looking at what's happening in the body, they're looking at all from the point of view of totally separated, got nothing to do with the names and attributes of Allah, and then they'll make these theories, well, oh yes, this is the reason why we're having this illness and that illness is because of flaw in evolution, because of this, right? And then we as Muslims, we study in their institutions, we take our sciences from them, and we come back poisoned with some of these ideas, right? So the point being, what a point I'm making here is, as Ibn al-Qayyim said, فَالْأَشْيَاء عُرِفَتْ بِهِ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ عُرِفَ بِهَا فِي النَّظَرِ وَالْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. Right? So even though in general people would reflect on the creation and derive knowledge of Allah through that, in reality it should be the other way around. Right? From all the names and attributes of Allah, we use them and we take them as the foundation. Then we start looking, okay, what's going on here? What's happening here? What are the names of Allah operative in this process? Right? Let's take, for example, bacteria, yeast, fermentation. What is happening here? Right? And so because we are asking very specific questions that arise from the names and attributes of Allah, it means that we are generally going to be in the right direction, and we're going to make the right interpretations of the observations. Do you understand? Right? So this is why, to illustrate the point, there was a man who had a fever. A man had a fever, and the messenger of Allah entered upon this man, and he said, "La ba's tahur insha'Allah." He said, don't worry, no problem, no harm. This will be purification for you. And as Ibn al-Qayyim explains, that the fever is a purification of the body and the heart, the soul. Because your sins are expiated, and likewise your body is purified. And once you've had a fever and you come out with the fever, you actually feel more healthy, you feel rejuvenated. And that's because that is one of the purposes of the fever. The fever is basically, it's a type of, what it does is it accelerates the healing process, right? So basically, if you have issue with the liver, you have like hepatitis, from our point of view, what's happening? What's happening is that a part of the tissue has died, then the inbuilt healing mechanism Allah has put in there, right, is in operation. So the dead part of the liver is being broken down into individual pieces, and then through the bloodstream, it will eventually be expelled over a period of weeks or months. As that's happening, new tissue is being regenerated, and that process might involve symptoms of varying severity. You might have a strong fever, you might have a weak fever. All of that is actually part and parcel of the correcting process of bringing life back to that part of it, right? So this is how we would look at it. So if you have a fever, you're thinking to yourself, well, actually, this is just a fever is it's basically accelerating the process of healing. It's a bit like, to give an example, it's a bit like you have normal traffic that travels on the roads, but then you have the police and the ambulance and the fire engines, right? And they come with the sirens and they go speed and they overtake all of the cars because they want to get to some place, right? In the same way, that's what the fever is trying to do in your body. It's trying to accelerate the healing process to get things moving quickly, right? So this, we would look at this and say, this is put into the body by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, Al-Shafi, Tabib, right? And this is how we would make the interpretation. This is meaningful. There's something meaningful behind this. And this is the same with all other symptoms as well, all the other symptoms, right? When you have diarrhea, when you are sick, right? The reason why you're having diarrhea and you're sick is because the body is relieving itself of all things which are wasting energy to focus on the cure. So the body is effectively saying, right, dump everything that's in the colon, get rid of it, because we don't need to deal with that, because we need to use resources somewhere else. And likewise, if you drink something and eat something and the body is rejecting it, it's doing it for a purpose. It's not haphazard, it's doing it for a purpose, right? It's basically saying, look, we're trying to do something in a certain place. We can't be diverting resources and wasting time on trying to break down a steak or something else. Get rid of it. Sick, whether it's this way or that way, get rid of it out. So the body knows what it's doing. And it's trying to do something. You have to help it to do what it needs to do, right? So my point being in all of this, coming back to the issue about the fever, the fever is purposeful. It's meaningful, and it purifies the body and the soul from sins and from impurities. And when you come out of it on the other side, you're purified in terms of sin, and you are purified in terms of the body. That's why, as Ibn al-Qayyim says, that after a fever, people always feel more rejuvenated, refreshed, stronger, because there's been some new generation of life internally, right? So this man, what did this man said? This man, he said, but the fever, what do you mean? The fever, it sends men to the graves, right? So he didn't believe and accept and understand what the messenger was saying to him. And he just made a remark saying, but this fever, it sends people to the graves. So the messenger of Allah said to him, so be it. Then so it is. Meaning that if that's what you see from it, then that's what you're going to get from it. Let it be so in your case, right? So meaning that as you anticipate, as you think of it, then let it be. So, and this illustrates the point that I'm making, is that if you understand what is happening from the root of Allah's names and attributes, then you will be correctly guided in all things, right? In your knowledge, in your foundations. But if you come from a different angle, so now the people of disbelief, what do they say? They say, oh, well, all illness and all disease is simply a byproduct of a haphazard evolution over time. And that's why people suffer illnesses, right? And so therefore we have to now correct these illnesses. Why? Because and this is where they start speaking about, doing gene modification and doing all this MR. This is the theoretical foundation upon which they are saying all of these things, that somehow we are now going to perfect man because he is a haphazard creation. There is no creator. This is nonsense, because we can clearly see this man, man has a deficiency in everything. He's prone to disease, he's prone to this, he's prone to that. So now let us perfect man and make him a perfect being by way of the principles of evolution and so on and so forth. So my point being is based upon the speech of Ibn al-Qayyim. This is very, very important for us to understand that all of our knowledge of Allah's creation, the starting point should be His names and His attributes. And we ask questions on the basis of those names and attributes, and we develop our understanding on the basis of that. If we do that, we will be guided correct, and we will not be making mistakes. In the theory, not in the physical, the physical aspects of it, not in the interpretation of the observations, right? We will be correctly guided. The more we are far removed from that, then the more misguided and confused we will be in these particular fields, right? So, is that clear? Does that make sense? Inshallah. So I wanted to mention that at the end in relation to the names and attributes of Allah, because this does relate to our knowledge of the world. So, we can either see it through the names of Allah and His attributes, or we can just blindly follow the people of disbelief and accept their theories and accept their, and we will end up being confused. We'll end up not knowing what's haqq and batil. And we'll end up being confused and accepted by their false ideas and false principles. And so there are many things. So alhamdulillah, we'll close on that note for the salah. Just to finish then in brief, we added another 2 matalib, lofty objectives, that of tawassul and that of the names and attributes of Allah, and how Al-Fatiha, in the way it has been arranged, it contains these 2 matalib in the most beautiful of ways. And so with that, we'll conclude today's lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.